Good or good morning, depending on where you're sat or listening to this conference right now. Hello and welcome back to WTF is Sre version 2. So I have been around from the very beginning, where I was first involved in a webcast or a webinar with Nathan, and it was so popular. It was called WTF is Sre. It was so popular that we then kicked off the conference, which again was so popular we've done conference 2. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Jamie Dobson. I am the founder, believe it or not, if you can believe that, the founder and the chief executive of Container Solutions. And Container Solutions works with a bunch of people in the community to bring this event to the wider audience today. I am joined by Jennifer Riggins. Are you there, Jennifer?
Here I am. Nice to see you, Jamie. Still disappointed you didn't set fire to the back of your room before we started for a bit of oomph and flair, but that's okay.
I should have set fire to it. I should have indeed set fire to it. Jennifer, do you want to tell everybody who you are?
Sure, though I always appreciate seeing real firefighters anyway. I'm Jennifer Riggins. I'm a tech storyteller, and I'm excited to be an ancillary part of the Container Solutions team, hosting these events and writing for y'all and writing for a lot of people. I am probably the least technical person attending this conference. So if you think you don't know what's happening today, it's okay. I know less, but that's okay because we all need to understand what's happening in the future and what happens when things inevitably go wrong. So I'm excited to be here, Jamie. So Jamie, when you talk to clients, customers, however you want to call them, partners, how do you define site reliability engineering? Briefly, like if they don't know what it is. Because I love a definition.
I define it with great difficulties. And I think in many ways, that's because not everybody knows what SRE is, or people have different ideas about what it is. And I think in many ways it's a discussion, because one SRE model will work in one context, but might require a different model in a different context. Some people say things like, oh, it's just DevOps. I hear that quite a bit. Some people say, oh, we've been doing SRE for 25 years. And I sometimes think, oh, I don't think you have. So SRE is a hot topic, but like cloud native itself, it's a little bit misunderstood.
Fair enough. And we all know from the previous conference, I hate the word cloud native because nothing's native and most people aren't just in the cloud. So we always terrible terms and terms we're still getting used to. So you're mostly participating today, I think, as a viewer. What are you most excited? What sessions or topics are you most excited about?
They actually all look really good. I can see that Andy Martin from Control Plane is going to be talking about supply chain soon. I think this looks really good. But also chaos engineering is something that I'm really interested in. So that talk's coming up straight after Andrew. And chaos engineering, a lot of people talk about this, but for our customers, this is advanced stuff, right? This is what you do after you've done the basics. You've moved to the cloud, you've automated all your builds, you've implemented GitOps workflows. That's when you can start to think about really advanced testing techniques like chaos engineering. So I am really, really looking forward to that one as well.
Absolutely. And that's another one with a name that kind of terrifies. The higher up you get in a company, the more terrifying that name is. But there are some really great people in the chaos community. So that should be a lot of fun. I'm really excited, even though it's not my track, but I can't wait to watch and cover later the one about the James Webb telescope, because I guess nothing that we know of so far could have as many potential points of failure as an origami unfolding itself telescope that is out past Jupiter. And it's actually working better than they thought. So I guess they did good SRE, or they've been very lucky, or the other. And of course, the panel I think is going to be really exciting that I'm hosting later, because we're going to define some of that stuff and talk about, did Google define SRE, or did it just give a name to something everyone's doing differently? And how many nines do you really need? So I think it should be a lot of fun.
How many nines do you need? It's always good to get a NASA case study. I think that's going to be a brilliant one about the telescope. I only just watched Apollo 13 last night. I don't know why I put it on. I think it's new onto Amazon Prime. That's going to be a doozy. So I'm really looking forward to that one as well. Now, before we continue with any chit chat, I think, Jennifer, you've probably got some housekeeping you have to announce and probably the code of conduct is the most important part of that.
Yes, absolutely. So first, I do want to say congratulations, Jamie. It is a feat. In the last or two, there have been quite a few observability SRE type conferences coming out, but this was kind of one of the first, and it's very good that there are many and people are talking about this. And I'm really grateful to be here and grateful for everyone that's joining us today. So, housekeeping. These topics, security, observability, reliability, have all been kind of seen as lockboxes or need for this great wealth of knowledge, and someone has this experience and like one person on a team can do that. But remember, we're here to stop that today because shit is actually on fire, and metaphorically on fire if we're not talking about the earth. And everyone from developer to ops to SRE, all the way to C-suite, even those of us in a marketing communication need to know how to help put things out. Everyone has a role to play. And that's why, while great and wise firefighting masses have decided to keep this event online, we need your help in making it as interactive as possible. So go and check out on the left side of your screen, at least on my devices. You're going to have the People tab in this platform where you can filter by interest, send messages, arrange a meeting, and don't forget to visit our fabulous sponsors in the Expo tab on the left-hand screen. So thank you to the teams at Blameless, Stormfront, Teleport, Cortex, Shoreline, Lightstep, PagerDuty, Fire Hydrant, and Rootly, and of course, our lovely organizers, Container Solutions. Thank you for supporting this proliferation of firefighting techniques so that we can offer this to thousands of attendees for free. How great is that? And attendees, don't forget to go to the Expo tab to visit the sponsor booths. With both the people and sponsors expos, you can message back and forth and even launch a session for some face-to-face time if both sides agree. Now, we are a team of thousands of firefighters, so safety first. Maybe that was a mixed metaphor there. Please scroll to the bottom of the event website. You can go to cloud-native-sre.wtf. You will also see it in the platform, and please click on the code of conduct. Don't just click on it, read it. I hope you've read it already. We've kind of been reminding you. In a nutshell, as any of our events, and any events I'm involved with too, we do not tolerate harassment of participants in any kind. We do not tolerate harassment of participants in any form or kind. But we know that no matter how safe you intend an event to be, things can happen. If you witness anything you think might be breaking our code of conduct, and I do really mean this by if you're talking about anybody, it could be a Container Solutions team member, it could be an attendee, it could be a speaker, it could be a sponsor. Please find the team member. Container Solutions tell us. You can email events@container-solutions.com, or you'll find an anonymous form in the Hopin app under the fabulous welcome video of Carla and Teresa. Trust me, we take this shit seriously. But hopefully that won't happen. And we'll just have a lot of fun while learning. Today, we actually are raising money for 2 baby dragon sanctuaries, aka lizards, which are the closest thing to baby dragons. We have a really fun, you can dance if you want to, DJ session, and the always very popular SRE quiz where you get this exclusive bag of swag only us speakers get otherwise, or hosts even. So you really want to win it. That's one I'm looking forward to just watching, because obviously I have no idea, but I'm excited to watch people compete, and I love a quiz. This is all in addition to our 4 tracks on reliability, security, and DevOps, DevSecOps, and observability. And the schedule is showing up in your time zone, or it should, unless you've done something to block everything on your computer, as I know some of y'all do. So really hope you take advantage of it. And remember, while there are wonderful things about being an online event, you need to be as active as an audience member as you can, which I know y'all are probably working and coding and doing work while doing this. So do the best you can. We don't take time off anymore. I hope some of you got to today, but you want to give speakers feedback. Share on hashtag WTF is SRE, what you're learning, and please ask questions and comments and use the tool and give reaction emojis to support. Nothing here happens in a vacuum. So I just want to say thank you again for joining us. And I'd love to bring our opening keynote to the stage if she's ready, so we can go from oops to ops with the good, the bad, and the ouchie of real life firefighting in the world of SRE. Holly Cummins has a dragon, which is very exciting.
I didn't have any fire stuff in the house, and I again sort of declined to set fire to the room because I thought that's not good for speaker concentration, but I did bring a dragon. So
that's very exciting and a perfect accessory. I'm actually jealous. Hello. Well, I think you should, if you want to share your screen, Holly, that would be epic. So we can check that everything's working good. And I'm really excited to hear that, to learn from you as always, Holly.
Cool. So hopefully you all can see my screen now, because I actually can't see what you can see now for reasons.
Now we can. And there's a really cute robot on it. So good kickoff. Okay. I'll catch y'all at the end.
Just this morning I was thinking I should redo my whole slide deck to be dragon themed, but it was a bit too late, so we're stuck with the robots. So normally when I speak, I don't spend too much time introducing myself, but I want to today because some of you may know me from IBM, and a lot of the stories I'm going to tell are from my time as a consultant in the IBM garage. But as of a month ago, I have switched and I'm now part of Red Hat. It's so new that in this box, I don't know if you can see, in this box is the Fedora, and it arrived about an hour ago, so I haven't actually unpacked the box yet. But I have a confession to make, because neither in IBM or in Red Hat is my role actually an SRE. That there's a connection. In the garage, we worked in cross-functional teams, and my role now is that I'm a Quarkus software engineer, and of course in Quarkus we care a lot about SRE, but I am not an SRE. The good news is I'm not an SRE, but some of my very good friends are SREs. So really, I want to thank Jansu and Robert, because some of the stories that I'm going to be telling today are actually their stories that I've stolen. So Robert Barron is an SRE in IBM, and Jansu is an SRE in Red Hat. The good news is, if you think, actually, I would rather have the original version of the story rather than the secondhand warmed over version of the story, both Robert and Jansu are speaking today. So we've already spoken about Robert's talk. It's the James Webb Telescope talk, and Jansu is going to be doing what I think sounds really, really interesting about the connection between thinking about users, thinking about design thinking, and SRE. So before we go further, now that I've confessed I'm not an SRE, I'd love to know sort of who you are all. So hopefully, if you click on that QR code, it should take you to Slido. And when I've done this in the past, I've found that the poll results don't show up in the recording. So in the recording, it looks like I'm just doing nothing. And there's also a bit of a latency on the poll results. So for about a minute, I sit staring at this poll and no one's filling in the poll, and I get more and more embarrassed. But eventually results start to come in. So, oh, cool. So we've got some results coming in. So we're seeing a mix of some SREs, some people who maybe are aspiring to be SREs, some people who've just become SREs, some people who, like me, they're not an SRE, but some of their best friends are SREs. So they work with SREs or they manage SREs. So yeah, a nice mix. So yeah, some experienced folks. Yeah, now we're sort of seeing the trend go towards, I think, mostly new SREs, sort of deepening your craft. So, oh yeah, so it's still changing a bit. Oh, actually now we're sort of We've got friends of SREs sort of climbing up the results now a bit. Cool, this has been useful. I think this has given me a picture, and hopefully some of the other speakers as well, a picture of who our audience is. So I'll go back to the slides now. So normally when I talk about SRE, I like to start by, like Jamie did, what is SRE? And I thought, oh, for this conference, I'm not sure if that actually makes sense because this is an SRE specialist conference. But then I thought about it more and I thought the title of the conference is WTF is SRE. So I think really actually we are allowed to ask, it's the whole point of the conference, to think a bit about what is SRE? What are we all doing here? What is this practice? And there is a sort of an official definition of SRE, which is that SRE is what ops would be like if it was done by software engineers. And I have some problems with this definition, but I'll come back to those. For the moment, let's just take this definition. And when I first heard this definition, and I heard about some of the practices of SRE, I was really confused because I thought, wait a minute, aren't these practices obvious? Aren't these common sense? Isn't this how we've always been doing ops? Which I guess is the whole point of the definition, is that software engineering bias made me assume we were doing some things that actually weren't being done. So what was wrong with the old way of doing ops? Why did we need to change it and make it more software engineer centric? Well, the old ops, I think there's actually quite a lot wrong with it. It was extremely manual. So there was very little automation, and that meant that it was extremely repetitive as well. So you end up in this sort of goldfish day, or, goldfish memory groundhog day for ops. So it's like if you took a goldfish and a groundhog and they had a child, then it would be ops. And, that doesn't sound much fun for anybody, and it doesn't sound very productive. And the other thing about it was extremely siloed. So instead of looking across the organization, you have these tiny little goldfish bowls of people doing the same thing over and over again. And I think one of the worst things about it too is that it's not aligned to business goals. And what we mean by that is that the incentive for ops very strongly is don't let things break. So the business wants to do stuff, but the ops team is going, well, if you do stuff, it might break. And if we do nothing at all, that will be most stable. And then the business is going, tell me why I hired you again. And it just ends up in this really bad situation. And it was kind of a bad situation even before we went to cloud. So once you add the complexity of cloud and the complexity of cloud native, then it just ends up being really challenging to try and keep doing things the old way. So what SRE is doing is it's eliminating repetitive tasks. And the fancy SRE word for this is that we're eliminating toil. And another really important thing that we're doing is we're aligning the incentives. So we're all in the same goldfish bowl together. We're all trying to swim in the same way. One of the things that goes along with this is how we think about failure. In the SRE world, failure is not the cause of the problem. Failure is a symptom of a problem. And so then what we're trying to do is we're trying to root out what actually was that cause. And Jamie mentioned DevOps as well. And, this is sort of sounding a lot like DevOps. And I think there are some similarities with both DevOps and SRE. You're trying to automate everything. And with both DevOps and SRE, you sort of have this holistic and collaborative approach where you're trying to get outside the silos of your discipline and your team to look more at the organization. So this sounds awesome, right? Like, what could possibly go wrong? Well, just 1 or 2 or 37 minutes worth of things. But before I talk about that, I'd like to go back to the polls. So let's do another poll, which is, where did you come from? What was your background? If I probably only answer this if you are an SRE or an aspiring SRE. So if you're an SRE or an aspiring SRE, what was your background? Have you come into it from the ops side, or have you come into it from the development side? Or have you had sort of I realized that it was really reductionist, these questions. So we've got sort of a mix, I think, probably trending towards more of us coming into it from the development side, but then also coming in from the ops side. And of course, there's sort of variations of ops, and I've kind of made a distinction between being a sysadmin and the more general ops. But yeah, I think probably about half of us coming from development and half from ops, which I think is probably consistent with what I'd expect. And also I think probably a fairly healthy mix, because one of the things about SRE when it's done right is it does draw together these different disciplines. So that's the theory, is that when it's done right, it draws together these different disciplines. But then that leads us to some of the anti-patterns. So one of the things that we see is that sometimes an SRE transformation is pretty superficial. And sometimes it's so superficial that it's just, changing the name on the business card from ops to SRE. So often we'll talk to a team and they'll say, yeah, we're SRE now. We used to be ops, but now we're SRE. And I think some of this comes down to some of the problems with that definition that I was talking about. So this idea that SRE is what ops would be like if it was done by software engineers, it kind of feels to me like it's really saying software engineers are best, yeah, boo, we rule. Like I said, when I heard about the SRE practices, they seemed so natural to me. To me, it was like, oh yeah, well, of course, this is the way we should be doing things. But that's just my opinion. And I don't think it, I think it's a little bit problematic to kind of charge through on a rampage going, I'm a software engineer and I know how to solve all problems in all disciplines. And I think in particular for SRE, when we say, I'm a software engineer, I'm going to come teach you how to do your stuff because you've been doing it wrong, that doesn't necessarily make the ops team feel great about themselves or the work that they've been doing. And I think it also misses out on a huge amount of experience and expertise that team have. So I think it's quite natural as a sort of a question of, hey, wait a minute, instead of having SRE be ops as if it was done by engineers, what if it was just ops as if it was done by ops? Because like ops know ops better than anyone, right? Surely that's the most logical arrangement. Maybe. We do see some problems with this approach. Both Jansu and Robert, when I was talking to them, one of the stories they told me was they sort of arrived at a team and the team said to them, we got this. We've read the book and the book is the Google book. And then, it sort of goes on as, we're just as good as those teams in the book because look, we've got scripts. But then when we start to ask more questions, it sort of starts to fall apart a little bit. So when we talk about automation, a really good question is, okay, well, we've got the scripts, great. What triggers the scripts? And sometimes it's, well, we watch the system, and if we see something going wrong, we go away and we push the button and triggers the scripts. Well, that's not as automated as we could be, is it? There's still a high degree of manual monitoring and manual intervention there. What we'd really like to go for is automation that's a bit more automated. Another thing to ask is, okay, how much contact do this SRE team have with development? And often when we ask that, the question we get back is not all that much. We have a great big wall between the teams still. And development throw the artifacts over the wall to SRE and then our SRE deploy it, which if you're paying attention, sounds a lot like old ops. And so then the question is, okay, well, do we ever throw the ball back the other way? Are there any SRE NFRs in the dev backlog? Are we pushing work to that team? Often the answer is no. And sometimes the answer is even more disappointing than that. Sometimes the answer is, actually, yeah, we haven't pushed that work to that team because we never really thought of speaking to them. And so, this is a problem. This is a case where we have the technical elements of the solution, or maybe even only half the technical elements of the solution, but that bigger part of it, of being holistic, collaborative, breaking down the silos, we've just completely missed. And this can be the case when we talk about the relationship between SRE and development, but it can even be the case between different SRE teams. A while ago, one of our clients, it was a large bank, and they had, as many banks do, they had a large mainframe system. And the system had been designed so that at the end of a shift, a teller would push a button and it would make an API call to the mainframe, and that would be that. So it was called very infrequently. But then, of course, the modern world happened, and the bank wanted to add a mobile app. So they created this mobile app. And what the mobile app did was, instead of doing it once at the end of a shift for a very small group of staff, it was the entire customer base of the bank, and they were doing it pretty much every few seconds when they were using the app. And it didn't last long before the mainframe started smoking and fell over, because it just wasn't designed for that kind of workload. So the way they dealt with the incident was they did a war room, but there seemed to be two systems that were having problems. So they had two war rooms. And one team, they felt that the limits of their responsibility was the stability of the mainframe. And the other group felt that the limits of their responsibility was the stability of the front end. And of course, they knew that there was a connection between these systems. So in order to make sure that there was communication, they had an ambassador who would go back and forth carrying messages between the two teams. So I think you can see that this isn't going to be the most efficient way to solve this problem. And it does lead to this kind of blaminess as well, where the mainframe team said, well, you're not using our system correctly. And the front end team said, well, your system is falling over. And it just didn't end up being the most productive relationship. And this tendency to break things down by team is really strong. So, you end up with the ticket per team, not per incident. And that isolation can be showing trust problems as well, because of course we're more likely to trust people in our own team than people in other teams. So we spoke to a team. They were sysadmins, and they wanted to move to sort of more of an SRE approach, but they had a real problem when they needed to do some diagnostics on the database. So they just didn't have ownership in the entire overall system. And if they wanted to just run a diagnostic check on the database, the DBAs would have to do it, and they'd have to sort of enable the permission. So it would take them 15 minutes just to get permission to run like a super standard non-custom set of SQL statements. So you can imagine that this is going to be pretty bad if you're trying to sort out an incident. And really, what we're seeing with this is these silos. It doesn't just make us feel bad. They have a real cost to the business, and they have a real impact on our ability to resolve problems. So what happens if we do get a problem? Well, of course, we do a post-mortem. And this is one of those things where everybody knows you should do a post-mortem, or maybe you call it something else, but everybody knows you should do a post-mortem after every incident. But in practice, if you actually say, okay, so you do postmortems after every incident, so can you show me the records for the postmortems? And well, actually, that one didn't get a postmortem, and then that one didn't get a postmortem. So it's so trivial, but it's quite useful to measure the number of incidents, measure the number of postmortems, and see if they match. Often they won't. And then if you want to get really, advanced, once you've actually got those two kind of in parity, think about how many people were in the postmortem. Is it just 2 people staring at the screen? Obviously, it should include the people who are directly involved, but really you want to include more than the people directly involved, because this is an opportunity to share learning with the wider team. So you want to invite others so that they can learn. Another thing we see is that sometimes postmortems, they end up being a little bit quiet and no one is actually saying anything. And that's because sometimes there's a gap between the theory, the blameless postmortem, and the reality. So if people think they're going to be punished because they were involved in an incident, not only are people not going to say anything in the postmortem, they're not even going to actually engage with systems, because they want to keep the limits of their responsibility as small as possible, to keep the limits of their blame as small as possible. And there can be a more subtle problem as well. Even if we're not punishing people and blaming people, if instead we're being really encouraging and supportive and positive, that doesn't necessarily always encourage people to speak up. Because if someone speaks up and we say, as a manager, as a senior leader, that is a great idea, Jeff. Go build that, Jeff. No, I haven't reduced the rest of your workload, Jeff. Then Jeff is going to be like, well, why would I volunteer? Because I just get extra work if I speak up. The next problem we see is metrics. So I think, metrics are one of those things that we could talk for an hour just about metrics and only scratch the surface. But they're really important for SRE. So when we talk to a team, of course we want to see that they have success metrics, that they have metrics, because metrics are good, and SREs are very data driven. So, they're extra important for SREs compared to other disciplines. But metrics can go really wrong really quickly. So as a senior leader, if that's your role, you need to be really careful what you're incentivizing with your metrics. And you also need to be really careful and think about, well, what behaviors am I discouraging because of these metrics? Are those behaviors that I actually want in a bigger business context? And as a trivial example of how metrics can sometimes lead us to the wrong conclusions, it's sort of a natural first thing to say, well, we're going to measure ourselves and we're going to measure how many incidents we have. If the number of incidents goes down, yay team, we're doing a better job. Okay. What happens during the holidays? During the holidays, the number of incidents goes right down because people are doing less work. Does that mean we're doing a better job? Does that mean our quality is better? What about in the summer holidays? The whole team's on the beach. The number of incidents goes right down. If we have fewer people working, obviously we're going to get fewer incidents. And on the other side, if we do a new release, it's just natural. We're going to get more incidents. So if we only measure ourselves by the number of incidents, we're going to end up sending the team to the beach. Not so good. So we really need to think through so carefully when we're measuring. Are we measuring the right things? And what are we doing with these measurements? And also, how do people think these measurements are going to be used? I heard this phrase, and I just love it, which is, sometimes people are legitimately concerned that management are going to weaponize the metrics against them. And there's all kinds of wrong with that, but the starting point to fixing that really is that our metrics shouldn't be about evaluating who in the team is best. Metrics should be trying to measure things, not people. Okay, so if metrics are good, but all of the obvious metrics like number of incidents are bad, what do you do? Where do you even start measuring? Well, one of the things that's a good starting point to measure is, let's make work visible. A lot of teams, when you talk to them, they'll have a problem that they never seem to complete the work we planned. And so, they'll do their sprint planning and they'll say, right, so we know our work is a bit unpredictable. So we're only going to try and spend 50% of our time doing story points and, planned changes. The rest of our time, we're going to spend on the unplanned work. That's great, ideal. But then when we get to the end of the sprint and we look at it, we only got through 10% of the story points that we were hoping to. Our tickets were 50% as expected. So what's going on with that remaining 40%? Where did that time go? Were the team just slacking and doing nothing? And again, this is one where if you have your metrics wrong, you might come to that conclusion. You might say, what a terrible team. They're only doing 10% story points. But actually, when you dig into it, what's going on is that they're spending their time on email. When you look into it more, the content of the emails, it's all things like, oh, can you just do this? Or how do I do that? Or where's this documented? And so these tasks, the worst part about it is a lot of these queries, they're really repetitive. They're, back to this goldfish of doing these same things. So in this case, it wasn't that the team were doing a bad job. It was a data quality issue. And it was our process. The path of least resistance was to email the team rather than raise a ticket. So people were doing that. So this is where your metrics want to come in. So you want to be tracking that work. And if you keep getting the same query over and over again, get the data to bubble that up, automate that thing so that we can eliminate toil for the team. Another thing we want to measure is blockers. So if people keep getting stuck on something, surface that so we can fix it. And then there's some technical things that we want to be measuring. So what's our mean time to failure? What's our mean time to detect problems? If it's taking us a long time to spot a problem, that's maybe a problem. But actually, these metrics are less relevant now in a cloud native microservices world than they used to be. Because what even is failure? And ideally, one system will go down and we have enough resilience in the system, or one machine will go down. We have enough resilience, we don't even notice. If user experience isn't affected, maybe that wasn't a failure. Maybe that was like a win. So more sophisticated things to be measuring are things like, what have I learned? How have have I actually made sure that this bad thing won't happen again with a process change or with automation or with something like that? One of the things, and another one, that we see over and over again is an incredible reluctance to release. So we're moving in this fast-paced world, user expectations are that things, improve continuously. And yet when we're like, oh, can't release it. And I think a lot of this comes down back to that question of incentives. If a team feel that they have to have something absolutely perfect before they let it out the door, or they're going to be punished, it's not going to go out the door. So we need to look into, okay, well, what's actually stopping more frequent deploys? Often it's just a question of cost. It costs too much to release. The good news is you can fix that. This is where the automation comes in. Often it's a question of quality. We're not going to ship this thing because we don't actually have confidence in the quality. Fair enough, but you can fix that. Get that confidence continuously as you go through. And then we also, of course, want to change our definition of release. A release shouldn't be a big bang thing. We can make a distinction between deployment and release so we can get it deployed even if it's not actually exposed to anybody. Or we can expose it only to a small number of people with feature flags and things like A/B testing. And this is even worse with microservices. The benefit of microservices is truly realized when you can deploy your microservices independently. But I talk to a lot of teams where even though it's developed as microservices, it gets deployed, it gets released in a huge chunk. And sometimes even the pipeline is organized to make sure everything goes out in a huge chunk. This is a more general symptom of some of the complexity and pain that comes with microservices. I don't want to talk too much about microservices, but I think we have to talk about them a little bit in the context of SRE, because they make SRE so much more difficult, but also so much more necessary. So we dream that with microservices, things are going to become more decoupled, but in reality, often actually they become more coupled. And every time something changes in one area, everything else changes. Not so good. So it's important to remember that decoupled and distributed are not synonyms. And just because a system runs across 6 containers, it doesn't mean it's decoupled. You're going to get a bunch of space stories from Robert later on. We have a shared hobby of SRE space stories. But I want to talk a little bit about one of my favorite space stories. Apologies to those of you who've heard this story 82 times already. At some point, people are going to start saying, Holly, could you speak for us? But could you please not tell the Mars Climate Explorer? But I keep telling it because it's the story that just, it keeps on giving. There's so much richness to this story the more you unpeel the layers of meaning. So this is the Mars Climate Explorer. And the mission with it was that this was many years ago, it was going to orbit around Mars. That was the theory. The reality was it went into Mars. And I think we can all agree this was a very distributed system. You can hardly get more distributed than part of it being on Earth, part of it being on Mars. They had 2 control systems. They had a control system on the probe itself, and then they had one on Earth. And they negotiated together about what the Explorer was going to do. And the root cause of the problem was that the units were different. The Mars Explorer was working in metric units. The Earth system was working in imperial units. Neither realized the other had a different understanding about the units, and so the system failed. So what this shows, obviously, is the importance of testing. Had these systems been tested together, the problem would have been found. It also shows the importance of talking and communication and collaboration. But of course, it's easy. It's so easy to say, right? Like, just, test it before you deploy it, then you'll solve all your problems. That's sort of true, but, sometimes, not always. Another sort of really famous space disaster is a European one. So it's not just NASA who make mistakes. This was the Ariane 5. And what happened with it was it launched and it went up for about 36 seconds and then it went, and that was the end of that rocket. And it was about $370 million worth of rocket. So it was an extremely embarrassing system. What had gone wrong? They had tested it, again, as you would hope, with the 370 million rocket, but they'd stubbed out one component. And of course, that component was the one that broke. Now, with the Ariane, you can sort of think of ways that the failure could have been avoided. But a lot of what I've been talking about so far of like, why don't you do, separate release and deploy, and why don't you do A/B testing? It doesn't actually work. It failed in 36 seconds. They had no chance to recover that system once it started going wrong, because that's, almost within thinking time of a person. And they couldn't A/B test it. They had to launch it. But the thing is, I think we sometimes think of all of our systems as like the Ariane, we can't test in production. But we can. We're not doing these rocket launches. Our testing, no matter what we do, is always going to be incomplete. And unlike the Ariane, we have the luxury that we can do A/B testing. We can test in production, and we can recover situations. So as long as things don't go unrecoverably bad in 36 seconds, we want to make sure that we're optimizing our processes to detect the problems and fix them. And that's probably more important than preventing the problems. So we really want to aim for resilience and recoverability. And what allows us to achieve those is observability. And this is where we can go back again, peel another layer of meaning from the Mars Explorer story, because one of the problems that they had with it is planets are quite large, as you may have noticed. And so the Earth system was on one side of the Earth. And so often they couldn't see the Explorer because it was sort of around the other side of Earth, and Earth was between it, and then sometimes Mars was between it. So they could only see this thing every few days. And so they were trying to piece together an understanding of what it was doing based on really incomplete information. And that's why they missed the fact that it wasn't behaving as they expected. So this feedback, it's just so obvious, but it's sometimes harder to do. Feedback is good engineering. The more feedback we can get, the better off we'll be. And so I've told a whole bunch of miserable stories of SRE and anti-patterns and people doing silly things, but I don't want to start your day off on a completely miserable note. So I do want to go back to some of the things that can be really right and great about SRE, because I think when SRE goes well, it's such a good thing and it makes such a difference for the business and it makes such a difference for the people as well. So going back to a bank story, the bank with the mainframe that had the two teams and the little ambassadors going back and forth between them, where one was responsible for the front end and one was responsible for the mainframe. That team, honestly, was in a fairly bad place. But there was another department in the same bank. So we have the same sort of top level organization. But what this department did was they had some quite different systems that they were managing. So they had a back end and then they had this front end that was all webby. And it was managed by one team. Different skill sets within the team, but they were all working as one team. And so when that team needed to add a mobile front end, they were able to just expand the boundaries of the team and add in that new system pretty easily. And so it worked really well. And what was interesting about this is that they were able to work as one team, even though the disciplines involved are pretty different. So on the back end, it was AIX. They hadn't really got it very DevOpsy, very continuous delivery yet. They were doing big bang deployments. Whereas on the web and the mobile, they were sort of, a bit more modern, hip kind of ways of doing things. So they had the CI/CD pipelines, they had the canary deploys, all of that. And if you're curious, which is better, I think we all kind of intuitively know big bang deploys are bad, canary deploys are good, but they were actually able to collect the metrics to confirm this, which I like. So on the big bang deploys, they had a 50% failure rate, which is huge. When they were doing the canary deploys, their failure rate was only 10%. So they had many more successful deploys when they went for those small canary deploys. Here's another one with the suspicious DBAs, where the SRE team weren't allowed to do anything to the database. In that one, we were actually able to fix it with that team itself. So they had two root problems. One was that they just didn't have the automation. They didn't have the investment in automation. But then there was this sort of bigger problem of trust and transparency. So like the DBA team certainly weren't going to ship over scripts to the SRE team because they didn't trust the SRE team not to have a bright idea and change the script. So what we were able to do in that case is chat ops. And so the idea was that all of the automations were deployed to Slack. An SRE could trigger the automation, run the diagnostic scripts, and then get the answer. And what this meant was that the scripts were protected. They were really easy for the SREs to use. But then we got this sort of secondary benefit as well, which is that the DBAs could see how their stuff was being used, and they could see that it was being used. And then that gave them the incentive to go, oh, hey, this automation stuff is saving us time. It's making value. So then they started to invest in more automations. So it ended up being this kind of virtuous snowball where more and more of their previously manual work got automated and deployed by this mechanism. And so it really meant that the DBAs, they were quite happy about how it was going, and they could see the positive effect of their work. So I said I didn't want to have all sad stories, but of course we do have to think about, not just in those anti-patterns that I talked about, but for us, what happens when things go wrong? This is where leadership come back in. Leadership, they need to provide that safety net. Now I think we call it psychological safety. And leadership need to make sure that our culture is one of learning rather than punishment. And so obviously, hopefully every team knows that they should celebrate success. But I think in an SRE culture, it's really important to celebrate failure as well. And probably when you say we're going to celebrate failure, like Jen said, management kind of go, I'm not sure about this. But really, what we're doing and what we can call it is we're celebrating learning. Because if we learn something and we share it with the rest of the team so they don't make the same dumb mistake that we made, that's a really positive behavior, and management have to encourage it, even though it starts with the, hey, I made a dumb mistake and here's what I learned. And ultimately, with all of it, I think we have to, it's so much easier to make the right decisions if we remember the why of what we're doing. And I've stolen this from Jonathan Smart, but I really love it, which is that if we get it right, we're going to be doing things better. We're going to be doing them safer, just like the canary deploys. We're going to have fewer failures. It's going to be faster. It's going to be more efficient. And people are going to be happier. Work is going to be a happier place. And that's just something which is definitely worth striving for. And with that, I'll stop. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Holly. Yes, psychological safety. You avoided the word throughout, but that's all I kept hearing.
Yeah.
And red flag to psychological safety when you describe something as what ops would be like if done by a software engineer. And my understanding is probably anyone that works in operations is a trained software engineer. So they may be a little offended by that too. I just think it comes down to, like you said, you're talking about psychological safety, but that's really hard to measure. And still there's this messed up idea that this great resignation is happening because of money. And it's in our industry, it's not. In other industries, we can't speak, like people getting paid minimum wage and all, that's very different. But in our industry, people aren't leaving because of money. People are leaving because of bad management and stuff. But how do you communicate to your clients in a way that they listen, your clients, your customers, your C-suite, your leadership, that it's their fault because they're
Yeah, it's sort of, we talk about that kind of blame-free culture, and then eventually, all of us, we're all human, right? We want to say it's your fault. I think a lot of it is about trying to reframe it in terms of the business decision. So instead of saying we want people to be happier, because that sounds like, well, I'm not paying them to be happy, we go to, towards the first bit of it, of like, yeah, but if they're happier, think how much it costs you to retain. Think how much it costs you to recruit. Retaining is cheaper. And by the way, as a side effect bonus, your software is going out faster and it's a higher quality. And so it's about making that business case. And then at the engineering level, then it's kind of a different conversation. And there it's automation is fun. We have the best job, which is true.
Absolutely. But I guess automation, there's measurable benefits. But
Yeah.
I think happiness of workers is hard to measure, hard to know that they're unhappy, especially in the tech industry. Most of it's still distributed teams right now. So how do they
Yeah.
even learn about that to understand how to then motivate the teams? I'm not asking easy questions, Holly. Sorry.
Yeah, no, completely. And I sort of, because most large organizations, they'll be doing sort of some sort of pulse survey. And I haven't looked into it, but I always wondered, are those actually capturing what's going on, or is there some different metric that we should be using? What a lot of SRE teams look at is they can quantify the technical personal impact, because you can look at things like the number of call outs. So if your engineers are getting out of bed at 3 a.m, for 98% of them, that is not improving their quality of life, right? So you could say, well, okay, we're not going to punish people for incidents, but we are going to try and get to the point where we're not dragging people out of bed in the morning. And if that happens, our people are happier and we're all better off. So you can look at some of those sort of trying to figure out, well, what makes people happy, and can we measure that without actually asking them? So it's sort of, it's almost an observability thing again, isn't it? But it's observability of people rather than systems.
Who doesn't love to observe people? Yeah. No. I guess the next portmanteau will be HR ops or something, because I'm thinking those are often siloed, those pulse surveys that tend to be few and far between. And that is not being then communicated down from there. Well, thank you so much, Holly. You gave us a ton to think about. Weaponization of metrics really reminded me of my 5-year-old who weaponizes best friendship. I'm not going to be your best friend anymore. And it felt at that level of sophistication and maturity for a DevOps organization. So thank you so much. And thank you, listeners. You have a quick break, and then we're back. We start our tracks. We have room 1 has your security and DevSecOps track with Tim and I. Then Charles and Sebi will take you through observability in room 2, and room 3 will have Eva and Ile in reliability. Plus you have your on-demand What the Fuck is on TV. So go have a break, get some water, stretch. Don't be afraid to take us on a walk, and we'll see you in a few minutes. Thank you. Thank you, Holly. Bye.